Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to the University of San Diego's Humanities Center Fall Programming. I'm Cynthia Kaywood, and I'm serving as interim director of the center during Brian Clack's sabbatical. Despite our need to go virtual, the Humanities Center is offering a rich semester of programming, including art exhibitions, lectures, presentations, one-unit specialty courses, and other faculty-led series besides this one. Please visit our website for more information, or if you would like to receive our newsletter, please contact Lindy Villa, the center's executive assistant, and where you can sign up. I just also would like to say thanks as always to Dean Norton, to Lindy, and to Mrs. Vasiliadis for her generous support of the center's work. Today begins our fall faculty series, which is entitled All Change Here, Pandemics and Transformation. When I was considering what I was thinking most about last spring, it was not only the pandemic itself, but how historically pandemics have wrought great social and cultural change. And I thought it would be interesting to see what my colleagues in other departments had to say and thought about this particular issue. Our whole series begins today. It runs for 5 weeks. And here's a calendar that lets you know what each week is devoted to. So I hope you'll be able to join us for all of those, or at least one other. Today, though, we are going to hear from Del Dickson, and from Political Science and International Relations, and Alan Ginn from Economics. So let me begin by introducing Del, whom I'm sure most of you know. Del came to the University of San Diego in 1987, where he is currently a professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. In his 33 years at the university, he has served on all major faculty committees, been chair of his department and of the university's Rank and Tenure Committee, and is known internationally as a scholar and an outstanding teacher. One student on Rate My Professor remarked, "Dr. Dickson's class was probably one of the most difficult classes I've ever taken, and I can't imagine that I'll ever have a class that has such a heavy workload again." That being said, I also never learned as much in one class as I did this semester. Besides his teaching and generous service, Dr. Dickson has written extensively on the Supreme Court, justice in common law countries, lay justice, and the relationship between law and democracy. His most recent book is The People's Government, An Introduction to Democracy, and his earlier book, The Supreme Court in Conference, earned the National Association of American Publishers Award as the best book in government and political science in 2001. His ongoing academic interests include constitutional law, federalism and government structures, judicial behavior, and comparative and international law. Dr. Dickson also does numerous talks like this one for departments and programs across the university, including several years ago, the Davies Lecture on Teaching. My husband, David Hay, keeps this talk on his computer, reads it periodically, and would love to hear it revised for the post-pandemic university, should that day ever arrive. Dr. Dickson will speak to us this afternoon on federalism and pandemics.
Thank you, Cindy. That was just so nice of you. And Cindy, by the way, for those of you who don't know, and probably nobody knows, was my first office suite mate. I showed up at the University of San Diego, basically not knowing anybody, in 1987, and occupied a windowless office in Sarah Hall, and she was in the windowless office right next to me. And she helped introduce me around and made me feel welcome, and I have always thanked her silently, and I appreciate that she really did lead me around and show me the ropes around Sarah Hall. So thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm here to talk about disease and politics, which of course is everyone's two favorite subjects, and especially this year. I'll start at the beginning. As a political scientist, I never come at a subject straight ahead. I always have to take the long route around, and that's going to be true here as well. So I'm going to start at the beginning of the American experiment, and just note that America's founders were used to epidemics. They were used to mass die-offs from contagious diseases. They suffered from smallpox, cholera, yellow fever, scarlet fever, any colored fever you can name. Typhus, they were all regular occurrences. And until the mid-20th century, these kinds of uncontrolled communicable diseases, these epidemics, they regularly posed existential threats to communities and throughout history, city-states, nation-states. The example that always pops into my mind is that a plague helped to finish off Athenian democracy, the most classical democracy of all. Although, as we like to say nowadays about COVID-19, Athens suffered from pre-existing conditions. So there's that. Before the American experiment in Republican government, democracies were just especially vulnerable to all sorts of maladies. They were about as stable as Hollywood marriages. They burned bright but swiftly. And they burned until the inevitable factionalism, selfishness, corruption, and various crises, including disease, caused them to collapse utterly into chaos and or tyranny. So, in designing America's political architecture, disease and public health were an implicit, but probably not overriding concern. They just knew epidemics were an inevitable part of life, and they were one threat among many. But they were a threat, and they knew firsthand that governments were going to have to deal with these on a regular basis. Now, America 1.0 was the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles, outbreaks were handled exclusively by state and local governments, if for no other reason than there was no effective central government. It was a loose confederacy of states. It was kind of roughly modeled on Switzerland. And it didn't work very well. I mean, it quickly tottered on the brink of collapse. The 13 states were nominally cooperative, but in practice, they competed against each other, they undermined each other, and the weak central government was just completely ineffectual. So gradually, the American political class came to the conclusion that if we didn't come up with something better and fast, America was going to collapse and kind of join all of the other failed republics on the ash heap of history. Now, sometimes the hour produces the man, as they say, and in 1787, that man was James Madison. Madison was arguably the greatest, and I think surely the most underappreciated founder. He was America's chief institutional architect, and we owe him a huge debt. Now, it fell largely to Madison to develop the world's first fully conceived, fully functional model of federalism. It was designed to be a balanced Republican government where sovereignty was shared between local governments and a strong but limited central authority. And Madison sought to divide governments into different departments at different levels, to set ambition against ambition, and to spread political power among many hands, to prevent one faction from becoming too powerful or destabilizing. But he also wanted efficiency. He wanted effective government, and so the central government was going to have far more power than the Articles. What made Madison's model of federal republics, I think, so important, it's probably the most important contribution that American political theory has made to the world. What made his model so important was that it was uniquely capable of unlimited scale. Democracies ahead of that were small. Madison's model could be built up to an unlimited level. It could work in a nation state of any size. You just stitch different levels together and you could just stack them up indefinitely. So Madison's ideas, and by the way, he freely admitted that he stood on Montesquieu's shoulders in particular on this. It led to the world's first large, stable, representative democracy based on principles of individual liberty and popular consent. And it was something the world had never seen before. Now, Madison was the father of the Constitution. He was the father of the Bill of Rights. And along with Montesquieu, he was the father of federalism. And that, to me, is not a bad epitaph. Just as an aside, it's just curious to me, and I think it's interesting. So I want to note that Madison also drew from the Catholic doctrine of subsidiarity, and that's an important concept in democracy too. And that's the idea that problems should be handled by the most local authority practicable. Sometimes it's the local city or town. Sometimes it's county, state, federal government. But each problem should be decided as low on the ladder as it should be. Now, Madison was a realist too, and he knew political leaders were not always going to be statesmen or honest or competent or any of the above. And so a corollary selling point of his federalism model is that if one level of government or one branch of government is incompetent, ineffective, corrupt, oppressive, any or all of those things, ordinary people can turn to other levels of government for help and protection. It's like having 2, 3, or maybe even 4 parents. If one of them is rotten to you, you can appeal someplace else. And that is a benefit of federalism as well. So the second part of my talk is basically how federalism went sideways and how it didn't. Now, the first big fight about federalism and states' rights was over the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Federalist Congress, the Federalist President, John Adams, passed the Alien and Sedition laws to silence dissent and to punish their political opponents. The laws were clearly unconstitutional, but you have to have somebody call the executive on these sorts of things, and there was nobody there to do it. You had a compliant Federalist Congress, you had a compliant Federalist judiciary, and as a result, nobody questioned Adams' usurpation of the Constitution. And as a result, his judges locked up and harassed hundreds of people, including journalists, who were arrested, fined, and jailed. How federalism works into this. Madison and Thomas Jefferson responded to the Alien and Sedition laws with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And in those resolutions, they argued, in essence, if the federal government acts in an unconstitutional manner, state governments ultimately have the right and responsibility to intercede to protect their own citizens' constitutional rights. This, in my judgment, was a completely reasonable response to patently unreasonable laws. The problem is that, unfortunately, a generation later, Madison and Jefferson's resolutions were twisted around in a completely unintended way to serve as the rallying cry for Southern defiance to growing calls for abolition of slavery. And so Madison and Jefferson were repurposed and not in a good way. After the Civil War, Southern states go back to it. They resurrect the same racist spin on states' rights and the resolutions to resist and roll back Reconstruction in the mid-19th century, and then to impose racial segregation throughout the South in the era of Jim Crow. And finally, they used it one more time to justify massive Southern resistance to federally ordered desegregation after Brown v. Board of Education. This is the sad lesson of much of American federalism. For much of our history, states' rights has been little more than a code for racism. And maybe, well, we'll see where it goes. Well, all that nonsense was going on, however. Madison's theories about federalism were also being defined in a more benign, conventional way. The government had to establish practical powers, practical limits on state and federal governments. And that was largely left to the Supreme Court to figure out the details on a case-by-case basis. So, well, the racist theory of states' rights is going, there's a parallel process where the Supreme Court is trying to figure out what powers belong to the states, what powers belong to the federal government. And here is the essence of what happens. If the federal government has constitutional authority to act, then states have to yield under the Supremacy Clause. And that's kind of the first law of federalism. But that begs the question of when the federal government may act and what powers are going to be left to the states. And that brings us to the fourth topic, which is dueling superpowers. As it turns out, Madison and the Constitution end up giving both state governments and the federal government essential superpowers. And the Supreme Court quickly kind of blesses and develops these doctrines. The state superpower is called the state police powers. And the state police powers give the state governments exclusive rights to protect and promote residents' health, safety, and morals. This is an especially broad and potent power. And among other things, it gives the states, topical, the authority to deal with public health issues, including diseases, epidemics, and pandemics. That's the state police power. It includes citizen health. Significantly, the Supreme Court also decided in the slaughterhouse cases, mid-19th century, that the federal government has no general police power and cannot directly regulate the health, safety, and morals of American citizens. Now, I know what you're thinking, and it sounds wrong, doesn't it? We can think of 100 federal laws that deal with health, safety, and morals, but it isn't wrong. The federal government has no general police power. As it turns out, however, it has its own superpower, and it comes from a place you might not expect, and that's the Commerce Clause. Congress has always had primary power over the national economy. It's right there in Article 1. Chief Justice John Marshall read it broadly in Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824, I think. But the Supreme Court supersizes Congress's Commerce Clause powers in the 1940s. NLRB v. Jones and Laughlin Steel, US v. Darby Lumber Company. And in those cases, the court ruled that even if the federal government has no direct police powers, it can still regulate indirectly matters of health, safety, and morals by exercising its right to regulate national and international commerce. So this gives Congress the power to deal with any possible threat to the national economy, including disease. Now, the Supreme Court has been extremely deferential in letting Congress decide the limits of its own powers under the Commerce Clause, and it's become almost a blank check to act when and how Congress sees fit. Note here that the Commerce Clause, the federal government's superpower, belongs to Congress. It does not belong to the president. Now, President Trump likes to claim that Article 2 gives him the power to do pretty much whatever he wants. To put it simply, he's wrong about that. Of course, he completely misunderstands even the basics of constitutionalism and executive power, but he's really wrong about that. Section 5, Federalism and the Pandemic. So I'm going to start here with the first great epidemic or pandemic of the 20th century, which is the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 19. That pandemic killed 50 million people worldwide. It killed 675,000 or so people in the United States. That's a lot of people. This was before the court's broader reading of the Commerce Clause. So in the influenza pandemic, the federal government remained largely on the sidelines. All the key decisions were left entirely to state and local authorities. And of course, it resulted in a totally uncoordinated patchwork of state and local efforts to control the disease. You might sense that there is a theme that's starting to develop here. State and local governments, predictably, were all over the place. Some were very proactive, locking down their economies, quarantining. Other cities, other states took a laissez-faire approach, letting people do pretty much what they wanted. As a result, and as a rule, the jurisdictions that acted quickly suffered fewer casualties. Those who were slow to act in the first place or who lifted their controls early suffered the most. Overall, there was very little coordination or cooperation. There was very little transparency. The states and the cities ignored each other, or they feuded unproductively. You know, it was not our finest moment, and because of that, hundreds of thousands of people died unnecessarily. We realized that at the end, that it led to a never again moment for pandemics. And unfortunately, many of the lessons learned from that never again moment are being repeated this time around. So our vows of never again tend to have very quick use by dates because we forget. Americans are lousy at history, face it. Following World War II, the federal government now has its superpower of the Commerce Clause. And after World War II, the federal government begins to assume broad new responsibilities to coordinate and direct responses to future health crises. Washington became much more active in monitoring and protecting the nation's health and safety. Congress created and funded a large national health bureaucracy, all using the Commerce Clause, including the FDA, FEMA, the CDC, the NIH, you name it. You give me 3 or 4 letters and Congress funded it. Today, the government bankrolls scientific and medical research. It underwrites vaccine development, drug development. It keeps emergency stockpiles of essential equipment. Congress, roughly at the same time, a little bit later, passed Medicare to protect the nation's health, especially of the elderly, Medicaid, of the poor, and more recently, the Affordable Care Act, which to me, I could talk about this for a half an hour. It's an interesting lesson in federalism on its own right because it was passed using the Commerce Clause powers, but the Supreme Court upheld it by one vote, not on the basis of Commerce Clause, which is what they should have done, but on the Tax and Spend Clause. Chief Justice Roberts, who knows? Congress also gave the president considerable power to compel private companies to produce needed drugs and safety equipment with national emergency laws like the Defense Production Act. So the bottom line is, by 2020, the federal government was in a position to be effective and coordinate the response against COVID-19. So our current pandemic has to date infected more than 5.7 million people. It's killed almost 180,000 Americans, and projections have as many as 250,000 dead by election day. The 1918 pandemic had 3 different waves. We're currently in the middle, maybe the end of our first wave. Hopefully it's going to be the only wave of infection. But given what happened in 1918, given the current pressures to reopen the economy before the first wave has even fully subsided, which also happened in 1918, it might not be a sure thing that we're a one and done here, especially if there's no vaccine developed quickly. And that's, you know, this is what I kind of think of when people still say COVID-19 is like the flu. And my response is, yeah, it's like the flu in 1918, when 7/10 of the country died from it. The number 675,000 would translate to over 2.2 million deaths today. We tend to think of the flu as relatively benign, but it's what happens when you have a pandemic without a coherent policy, adequate testing and treatment, or a vaccine. We're still vulnerable, even if it is like the flu, which it isn't. The 2 main forces that pushed the US to reopen prematurely in 1918 are the same forces pushing us now, primarily business interests that want to reopen and religious organizations that want to go back to worship. They were the very 2 leading the charge against shutting down last time. They were ready to gear up and risk the consequences. And again, hundreds of thousands of people died unnecessarily because of that. The pushback we're witnessing now has the same elements, but it also has the addition of a strongly partisan election year tone, so it's supersized on that. Which reminds me of Mark Twain. He's supposed to have said it, he probably didn't, but he should have. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. We are going through a lot of the same things. It's a movie we've seen before. Like all pandemics, almost by definition, COVID-19 is a complex mix of global, national, and local problems. The economic and public health problems are global and national, but there's significant local differences. You know, it's not one size fits all. So ordinarily, this would give the state and local governments a leading role to play in setting policy, and that's how it is supposed to work under our Constitution. Central authority, but strong local authority as well. In theory, federalism should mean that the United States should be more agile to respond to these crises than a highly centralized government like, for example, France, where one government calls all the shots from the top down and may not appreciate local needs and local circumstances. In federal states that work the way that there should, the central government is there to coordinate, to advise, to support individual states with ideas, information, guidance, resources, key material. Will state governments make the decisions on how to apply these things, how to use this information? And this approach has worked quite well in other federal governments, notably Germany, Canada, and Australia. The American experience, unfortunately, has not been that good. Our reaction to COVID-19, again, just kind of we're repeating many of the same mistakes we made in 1918. I'll look at the federal response first and the executive response first. The executive response to COVID-19 so far has ranged from denial to magical thinking. It's been reluctant, it's been uncoordinated, it's been chaotic, it's been unreliable, it's opaque, it's completely ineffective, inconsistent, self-serving, and often contradictory. That's a long laundry list. I could go on. The administration has taken one crucial bit of medical advice to heart. It washes its hands often of any responsibility for this. Our national strategy has been in the White House to claim credit for any glimmer of hope and to blame the states for everything and push all responsibility on the state and local governments for fighting COVID. The White House has been uniquely ineffective at leading in the time of Corona. President Trump has dismissed it as a hoax. He's promised it would disappear by magic by summer. He's largely ignored the science, the data, constantly pushed to reopen, encouraged anti-mask protests. But he's done more. In July and August, he sought to block any additional money for testing and tracing. He sought to cut the funding for the CDC. And just today, there's more evidence that he's still pressuring the CDC to slow down and cut back on testing. Even his aides have admitted anonymously that President Trump is uninterested and bored and almost completely disengaged from the war on COVID. And part of it may be, frankly, there's a lack of good naming opportunities with pandemics, and that might be part of the problem. So we'll see what happens when there's a vaccine. There may be other branding opportunities there, and that is the one place that the administration has been effective, or at least potentially effective, and it's important. I mean, it's an essential one in developing a vaccine. Operation Warp Speed just might work, and if it does, well, good for the administration because they have pushed it, they've spent a lot of money, and that ultimately is what we're going to need to beat this pandemic. However, in the meantime, states and local governments have been left in the cold vacuum of federal leadership. There just isn't any. And states have competed against each other for crucial equipment. And kind of our reaction to the pandemic has been completely uncoordinated among states. It falls somewhere between the Wild West and a Marx Brothers movie, except not as funny as a Marx Brothers movie. So instead of providing states with solid information, federal government has just been issuing sporadic and contradictory advice and ignoring their own experts' advice in setting policy. The one thing I would like to highlight here before moving on to Congress is President Trump, about a month ago, just dismissed with utter contempt the idea that he is supposed to be the national shipping clerk in the war on COVID-19. He's not supposed to be sending out states' equipment. He's not supposed to be sending out masks or defibrillators or anything like that. He's not the national shipping clerk. And yet, when America is at war, as it is now against a disease, the national government's most essential job is directing war production and keeping the supply lines open. That is precisely how wars are won or lost. And you could just ask that old happy shipping clerk, FDR, or anybody who served in the military. It's the supply lines that matter. That's what Washington needs to do, and it has failed utterly in that job. So what about Congress? Unsurprisingly, the federal government and Congress, they proved somewhat better at throwing borrowed money at the problem. That's Congress's power, particularly the purse strings, and they have thrown a lot of money at the problem so far, at least in the first round of spending. And now, several months ago, Congress, with the Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, and Nancy Pelosi as chief negotiators, drove $2 trillion of stimulus spending through Congress with surprising speed. But they didn't have much oversight on it, and the money went to unintended places. Money intended to go to support small business largely went to big business. People, individual Americans, were supposed to get quick stimulus money. It was very slow to come out. Unemployment insurance was spiked. That was slow to be implemented, especially by states. So there was a lot of inefficiency there, and the money didn't go where it was supposed to as quickly as it was supposed to. Some states, again, have reacted well to the pandemic. They shut down early. They've had restrictions. They've taken it seriously. Other states have not. And we're seeing big result differences in what states are doing, which is okay. I mean, the record is still out on the consequences of disparate state responses. But whoever turns out to be wrong or right in how to fight COVID-19, there certainly is no coherence to it. We're more divided than ever, and the political environment is more Darwinian and even Hobbesian than it should be. The one thing it does vindicate, I think, one core theory of federalism, and that's Louis Brandeis's view of the states as laboratories of democracy. We experiment. States go their own way, and that's great. That's a strength of federalism. The problem is that in dealing with pandemics, local decisions have national effects. One state's decision to open up early affects every other state. In a pandemic, the lack of expert federal guidance and coordination can literally be fatal.
Dr. Alan Gin, who is an associate professor of economics in the School of Business. He received a BS in economics from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and a Master's of Arts and PhD degrees, both in economics, from UC Santa Barbara. Dr. Gin came to the University of San Diego in 1988 after having previously taught at Loyola Marymount University in UC Santa Barbara. Dr. Gin is a member of the USD School of Business Economic Research Center. His research interests include local public finance, urban transportation, and the economy of San Diego. On the latter subject, he is best known for developing and publishing the University of San Diego's Index of Leading Economic Indicators for San Diego County, a monthly report on the outlook for the local economy now in its 29th year. Dr. Gin's insights on San Diego's economy have made him a popular source for interviews, and he has given over 1,000 to local and national media sources. He is a regular contributor to the San Diego Union Tribune, and I regularly read his comments in the Sunday edition. Dr. Gin also has an interest in the business environment of Asia, of Greater China in particular. He is currently a member of the advisory board of the Asian Business Association of San Diego and sits on the board of directors of the Hong Kong Association of Southern California, San Diego chapter. He has shared his expertise with our international office and has taught in the University of San Diego study abroad programs in Hong Kong, Beijing, Shanghai, and London. Dr. Gin teaches a wide repertoire of courses, including urban economics, public finance, environmental economics, and at the graduate level, statistics, managerial economics, and the business environment of Asia. In 1994, our MBA students voted him Professor of the Year. Dr. Gin will be speaking this afternoon on the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you. Glad to be here. There's one thing in my bio that that you didn't mention, and that's because I don't have it listed there. And that is the fact that Noelle Norton and I went to the same high school together. We were only 1 year apart. I was 1 year ahead of her. I didn't know her really well, but we had some common friends. She said her family regularly ate at my parents' Chinese restaurant after church services after Mass on Sunday. Okay? I'm going to talk about the economic impact then of the pandemic. And if I could, I've never tried this from the point of view of a speaker. So I'm going to see if I can share the screen here, take over the screen. It looks like I can. So if that's okay, I've created like a little PowerPoint presentation that will talk about this because I'm a big numbers person. And so I got a lot of charts and figures and stuff like that. So I'm going to talk about the economic impact then of this of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what I like to start off with is the timeline as far as it's concerned. And this is for the US and only been for the year 2020. You see that it started, we had the first case in the US then on January 21st. And then January 30th, the first case of person-to-person transmission. The day after, a U.S. public health emergency was declared. This is when the president put a ban on foreign nationals, but only who had been to China then in the last 14 days. It turned out that that ban had a lot of loopholes, and as a result, many people came from China then even after that. The first death occurred then in the U.S. then on February the 6th. Notice that we basically wasted the month of February here. FDA opened up testing then on February the 29th. By March the 3rd, we had 100 cases then in the U.S. It was in the middle of March that I considered then the economy taking a big shift. To me, it was these two events right here, these 2 days on the 11th and the 13th. There was a ban on travel from Europe, but the NBA suspended its season. Okay, so it was the first indication that this virus then was going to have some sort of impact then on what people considered ordinary day-to-day type of activities, which included then watching basketball games. Okay, you notice that on that day the confirmed cases then topped 1,000. So from the 3rd to the 11th, then we had in an 8-day period, then the caseload increased by 10 times, at least the confirmed caseload. 2 days later, a national emergency was declared, and then the NCAA basketball tournament then was canceled. 8 days after, let's see, on the 19th, then notice that we here in California, Governor Newsom then issued the first stay-at-home order. This is the first by any state in the country, and then by that time we had 10,000 cases nationally. So notice that in 8 days we went from 100 to 1,000, and then another 8 days, 11th to the 19th, we went from 1,000 then to 10,000. Okay, oops. By March 26th, the U.S. then had the most cases worldwide. Notice that this was going like clockwork. 8 days after the 19th, our cases topped 100,000. So exponential growth. Every 8 days, the caseload was increasing about 10 times. Okay. By the 11th, by 2 weeks after that, by April the 11th, the U.S. then had the most cases then worldwide as far as the virus then is concerned. Okay, it took a little longer to get from 100,000 to 1 million, but that happened then on April the 28th, and then on May 11th, then states began then to loosen restrictions. People thought that this was under control, or they were tired then of these restrictions. They thought they'd done enough, and so states then began loosening restrictions then around May 11th. Okay, this has just had a profound impact then as far as the economy is concerned. And before I go on here, let me point out that I'm using a desktop computer at home, and so I'm facing now the desktop, and that's the camera. That's the camera then on top of the desktop, but my screen is off to the side. So for those of you wondering why you're getting a shot of my head, if you're looking at my picture, then that is the sort of the explanation then as far as that is concerned. Okay, but let's take a look then at the impact of this then on the U.S. economy. And so the GDP is the broadest measure as far as economic activity is concerned. This is the value of the goods and services produced in an economy then during a particular period. Each one of these little bars here represents 1 quarter. The GDP is usually released then on a quarterly basis, so each one of these bars then represents 1 quarter of economic growth or decline then in the U.S. economy. We're going to measure this as a percentage change. And these figures then represent an annualized rate. So they take the change for a quarter, then they extrapolate it then over the course of it. They said, what happens if we extrapolate this over an entire year? And then that's how they get these sort of annualized figures. You see then that if you go all the way back to 2000, we had a little bit of a slump in the early part of the 2000s, but this is the Great Recession right here. Okay, this was the worst decline since the Great Depression, this Great Recession. And you see that during the Great Recession, we kind of topped out. We had an 8% decline. We had an annualized 8% decline then in the U.S. economy. Sometime then in 2008, I think that was the 3rd quarter then of 2008. Okay, we've rebounded somewhat. Since then, and so this shows you then the growth in the U.S. economy. Just to give you some perspective, the long-run average growth in the U.S. economy is about 3.5% since the end of World War II. okay? And so we had growth probably less than that. You know, growth has been less than 3.5% then ever since the Great Recession. Things started turning down in the first quarter of 2020, okay, due to the pandemic. Even though, you know, according to my timeline, it really wasn't until about the middle of March that we had a big shutdown as far as the national economy then is concerned. It had some impact. That was enough to have some impact then on the first quarter where we had about a 5% drop in the GDP. You see that things basically collapsed in the second quarter. If you take the loss in that second quarter and extrapolated it over the entire year, the drop would have been about 33%. Okay, that is the biggest single quarterly drop then on record as far as the GDP then was concerned. It's just been a disastrous situation. Most of the economy was shut down then, or a large part of the economy was shut down then for most of the months of that second quarter, April through June. Okay. This chart here shows you how this changes is broken down. So again, here is that 33% drop then in the gross domestic product. Economists usually divide the GDP into four different components: personal consumption expenditures, gross private domestic investment, government expenditures and investment, and then net exports of goods and services. You see that in terms of contribution to this 33%, the latter two categories, government expenditures and net exports, then are positive. You know, they contributed positively, although very slightly. You know, very slightly then to the change in GDP. It was these other two categories, in particular, personal consumption expenditures, which fell almost 25% then in this second quarter, then of 2020. You see then that we also had some problems in terms of gross private domestic investment. That is businesses investing then in plant and equipment. That is also then construction then of new housing in that category as well. That was falling at almost a 10% then annualized rate. But this was largely then a consumption-driven decline. You would expect that with all the businesses, restaurants and retail and things like that closing. Okay. Here's a breakdown then as far as a specific component. Now notice that I'll go back here that this personal consumption expenditures, those are on both goods and on services. Okay. So consumption is about 70% then of the gross domestic product now. We've become a service type of economy. And then within consumption, services is about 2/3 to 70%. So again, we're a consumer economy, and a lot of that consumption then is in terms of services. Okay. And so the decline in consumption was just dominated by the decline in services. Okay. So again, from earlier, about 25% of the decline then, there was about a 25% decline then in consumption. Of that 25%, 23% of that was in services. Okay, and this pie chart here shows you a breakdown then as far as that's concerned. You see the biggest drop in that second quarter was in healthcare, which is kind of ironic given the news stories about the hospitals being overwhelmed. But you probably also heard that when those hospitals were overwhelmed, they had to cut back then on their elective surgeries and other procedures. And so that is what represents this decline then over here. There was also a big drop in things like dental visits because they had to close the dentist's office until they figured out in the safe way then that they could provide then dental services and other things. So a lot of the basic healthcare services declined then during this period. Okay, you see some of these other parts too here. Here is transportation. You know, this decline was largely due to declines in air travel. Okay, people weren't traveling then, as far as that's concerned. Recreation had a big wedge here then. In addition to things like visits to national parks and other places, sporting events. This also then included, though, the closing of gyms and things along those lines. Okay, but the second biggest decline then in terms of services after healthcare occurred in food services and accommodation. You know that the restaurant industry was really heavily impacted then by the decline. You know, they had to shut down. They could not offer things other than takeout or drive-through in terms of services. And so there's just been a huge impact then on food services, and to a lesser extent then on accommodation. It turns out that hotels could undertake a lot of things to promote safety in terms of their accommodations, but the fact that people weren't traveling, they didn't feel comfortable traveling by air, and there are no places for them to go because a lot of places were closed, impacted then the hotels more negatively than you would have expected. And then there's this broad category of other services, which includes things like barbershops and beauty places and things along those lines. A lot of the personal services then fell into this particular category then right here. And again, that was impacted because it involved in a lot of face-to-face contact or a lot of person-to-person contact, which is limited in during this pandemic. Okay. This has impacted employment. This chart again here shows you then change in employment in the national economy. Each one of these bars now though represents a month, a single month then of employment change. So you see then that during the Great Recession, we had then all of these months where we were losing at its peak about 800,000 jobs then a month as far as the national economy is concerned. We had this long uninterrupted stretch then of positive job growth, at least in the private sector, you know, starting from around the beginning of 2010. And then things just dropped off the map. This bar here shows you what happened then in March. This is not just the right-hand side of this thing, but this is a monthly change where we lost over 1 million jobs then in March. It's gotten a lot worse since then. You see then that in April we lost about 21 million jobs. I could not put that on this chart, or it just would have dwarfed all these other numbers in here where we're just getting jobs lost in about the hundreds of thousands, and now we're getting changes then in terms of millions of jobs. So lost 21 million jobs in April, gained back about roughly half of these things, slightly less than half, maybe 44, between 40 and 50% then of those jobs. But 2.7 in May, 4.8 in June, but then things slowing down then in July. I think what's happened here is that in May and June, we've gotten back the easy jobs, the low-hanging fruit, the easiest jobs then to come back. It's going to be more difficult from here on out then, I think, in terms of national job growth. If you break this down by sector, this I think shows you a lot of important, it gives you some important perspective in terms of where these losses then are occurring. These are employment changes by sector. Again, if you compare this from July, which is our latest reporting period, to prior to the pandemic, February. So you see then that we start from the bottom. The biggest losses is in leisure and hospitality. Again, that is the restaurant industry. We've gained some of those jobs back, but still down more than 2.5 million jobs then in leisure and hospitality. Okay, business and professional services. Business and professional services is a broad category that includes a lot of things at the high end, including management, including things like architects and lawyers and research and development, things like that. But it also then includes people then in waste services, in landscaping, in janitorial, in clerical then as well. And we don't have, I haven't been able to dive into the data, but I would expect then that the bulk of this professional business services have occurred then for people at sort of the lower end then, as far as that category is concerned. And again, you see now some of the other things here. Retail trade lost almost 1 million jobs. Healthcare services down then as well. Again, we mentioned the transportation, almost a half a million jobs lost. Again, primarily then in the airline industry. Okay. And so that then will give you an idea of sort of the breakdown there then. This shows you then what's happened to the unemployment rate then. During the Great Recession, we topped out at about 10%. Due to this thing, we hit almost 15% then in terms of the unemployment rate. We've come back somewhat, but again, now the unemployment rate is still 10%. To me, this is the easiest. This is the easiest part of the comeback. It's going to be more difficult now to drive that unemployment rate further downwards. Some people don't expect that will reach where we previously were until maybe 2023. So this thing could last then a really long time here. Let's take a look at the impact, the economic impact here. A big one to me is just increased inequality. Okay, the job losses were largely in the lower wage service sector jobs. Again, leisure and hospitality, services overall, in general, and retail. Okay. Another impact in terms of inequality, greater prevalence of the disease in communities of color. Again, that showed the disparity that we had in terms of healthcare and health issues, pollution, food access, high density living then. Likely more prevalent then in terms of communities of color. And then a lot of the initial stimulus went in the form of corporate bailouts. Part of it was to protect jobs, but it turned out that businesses ended up spending a lot of that then, or some of that then on other things, and so again, a lot of the money then went towards the higher end, and that has given a boost to the stock market, which again has sort of increased the inequality then that we see. Okay, there's been a lot of pressure on state and local governments fiscally. Del mentioned them having to take on the burden then, but what's happened is we have reduced tax revenue to state and local governments. One of the biggest sources of revenue to state and local governments is the sales tax. And with people not eating in restaurants or shopping in retail stores, things like that, then the sales tax has just been hammered then as far as generating revenue then for state and local governments. And local government in particular, a big part of a local government finance comes from the hotel tax. Here in San Diego, we call that the TOT, the Transit Occupancy Tax, and with fewer people staying in hotels now, that has really impacted then state and local governments. And they then have also had to increase expenditures then in terms of dealing with this disease, taking mitigation measures, and then maybe some expenditures too then on healthcare. So this has caused a huge fiscal problem then for state and local governments. They are not allowed then to run deficits like the federal government, and as a result of that, there's threats then of cutbacks in state and local employment then that threaten then to make the employment situation worse and to worsen then the economic growth that we have then in the country, because government workers spend money too. And so if they're laid off, that's again have a negative impact on the economy. At the federal level, the relief packages have just ballooned the federal debt then and the deficit. Okay, let me spend some time talking a little bit about this increased inequality. In economics, we use something called the Gini coefficient then to measure the level of inequality. And you see then that this shows you the Gini coefficient in the U.S. since the 60s, and it's been steadily increasing, particularly since the 1980s. Okay, it's just been on a rise, and a lot has been written on why that might be occurring, and so I can get a little bit into that later on. But I'm just kind of running out of time here, so let me put out a few things here. This shows you sort of the global Gini index, and you see then that the greener you are, then the more equality you have. That's how the Gini index works. The higher the number, the more the inequality. And so you see then that the greenish areas are Canada, Northern Europe in particular, but most of Europe then as well. Australia then you see over here. U.S. here, it's in the pink category, sort of in this 40 to 45. Note that the Gini coefficient is difficult to calculate, so it's not calculated on a regular basis. It takes a while for the data then to come in. The latest numbers I showed here was from like 2016, so that's been a while. things have undoubtedly got worse then as a result of this. And I bring this up because in an event last night involving my LLC on the COVID-19, it was brought up that the outcomes in Europe have probably been better because they have more inequality, that they have less inequality than in terms of health and health issues. And this illustrates that, okay? That illustrates that situation. We do have a more unequal situation, and that has helped in spread the disease here. This shows you here, somebody did this by county up to 2010. This shows you then where we have the most inequality. It's odd. You do have like rural areas of the South and in Texas and things like that, Rio Grande Valley here, but you also have the high finance centers, New York and the Bay Area and Los Angeles tend to have large amounts then of inequality here. Okay, let me conclude then by talking about some of the policies then that I feel then are going to be needed that have been kind of tied up here in Congress. Got to have a continuation then of this $600 a week boost into unemployment. Some claim that it's a disincentive to work, but given this weak labor market where you have unemployment at over 10%, it's needed. You know, again, people are worried then about going back to work. I need a continuation of this paycheck protection program too, to prevent businesses then from folding. An extension then of the eviction moratorium. The president signed some sort of executive order that was more of a suggestion than an executive order. And so we're faced then with a situation where there might be a lot of evictions, which could lead into a surge in homelessness in this situation. For in San Diego, California here, and in California, we have a statewide moratorium then on that. So that should help at least locally. I mentioned the fiscal problems that state and local government have. Again, need massive amounts of aid then the state and local government then to avoid the layoff of public employees, or again, that's going to make the economic situation worse. And then finally, then we have a need of reform then of the healthcare system. Okay, this pandemic showed then the problem of tying health insurance to employment. If you lose your job, then you're in big trouble in terms of insurance unless you go on Medicaid, or you buy insurance then through the Affordable Care Act exchanges. But this tie between employment and health insurance then is just problematic and leads to just vast inequalities then as far as healthcare then is concerned. These are sort of the economic policies then that are needed, but really the solution to the economy would come if you've solved the pandemic. The economy is not going to get back to full strength until people feel comfortable enough to go to the movies, to go and eat in restaurants, to go back to gyms, to go to sporting events, to travel again. And that's not going to occur then until the healthcare issue is taken care of. And so to me, that's a false dichotomy that you got to choose then between the healthcare issue and the economy. You got to solve the healthcare issue before you get the economy then back on track. Okay. And thanks. That's my presentation there then. Okay.
We have a few minutes left. I think enough for each of you to answer a question that's been posted. One of the questions for Dell was, what changes do you see coming in government? Because what you have described as our current government's response.
One of the initial changes, that's a really good question. One of the initial changes that I thought was interesting, that turned out to be kind of an illusion, is that in response to the pandemic, states started linking up with other states nearby, or they had an affinity for one another. And so if you didn't have national coordination, at least you had the potential for regional coordination. And it was promising and it was innovative. It just didn't last for very long. It turns out it's much easier for governors to agree to do something than it is actually to follow through on it. So I thought that was one of the interesting things that could have come of it. Another change, I think, and maybe this is the most important change that can come of this, is that really for the first time in our lives, I mean, in a profound way, who your governor is really matters in your everyday life. Because the power in some degree has shifted from Washington to the states, and the governors are really literally making life and death decisions about health. They're making life and death decisions about the economy. They're trying to hold their economies together. And it might in the long run at least begin a reassessment of the proper balance between what the federal government's power should be and what the state should be. And it might be, most of our history, especially since the beginning of the 20th century, the industrial age, it's been a transfer of power from the states to the federal government. And there may be some reconsideration of that. And potentially that is a profound change. It hasn't happened yet, but there's certainly preliminary indications of that.
And Alan, a question that I had was, I wasn't sure where higher impact data was included in your pie chart. And I was wondering if there's been much collected on the impact of this pandemic on the economy of higher education institutions. I have a daughter who works in international education, for example, and the bottom's just fallen out of that particular segment of university, sort of business and revenue.
Right now, it's too early to have data then as far as that's concerned. Things shut down in the spring, and so at that point, universities were not. The students that had paid for the term, and there was not much in terms of overall impact then after that, other than say housing, housing like we experienced here here at USD. But with the fall terms starting, again, not much data has been gathered yet then as far as that's concerned in determining what that impact is. In some places, some schools then are continuing with international in the sense that the students now can participate remotely then from their country, and they can still then enroll in classes. This semester in my group of freshmen, I've got somebody from Ethiopia, somebody from India, and somebody from China, and other people from the Middle East. So we're still getting some international enrollment, but again, unfortunately, the data is not there yet on that impact.
Do you have any kind of sort of crystal ball that tells you what you think we might see coming out of what you've just observed so far locally, or?
In terms of education, or in terms of the economy overall?
In terms of what kind of impact this might have on institutions and how they do their business.
Yeah, there are massive changes in the economy. We're seeing then increased working from home, for example, and so a lot of the tech companies now have started to allow their workers to work remotely, and as a result, workers then are moving away from the corporate headquarters. The Bay Area has, for example, experienced then a lot of people moving out, seeking cheaper housing, basically, but still being able to work remotely then for those companies then located in Silicon Valley. And so we're going to see things like that. But man, the whole structure, a lot of the structural impacts of this are going to be felt in for a long time. I mean, there is, for example, entire segments of the economy that are devoted to dealing with people then who work in an office. Okay, people who sell business clothing. Restaurants that serve people for lunch, things along those lines. Again, companies that just provide services, and all of those things are going to be impacted. I like to point out that some things are small. Some things some impacts are small. For example, we don't get those free samples anymore at Costco. But that's a few people. That's a few people then who are employed in doing that. And so you add this up over all, a lot of companies, a lot of stores then all over the country, and then you just get some serious impacts then when you look at it on a macro basis. Unfortunately, though, right now, this is just so new that nobody has really any idea at all then how things are going to go really from here.
Yeah, I think that perhaps one of the few positives that's come out of this is that there's going to be a whole lot of stuff for future academics to study and
Yes.
teach based on this kind of cataclysmic event, ranging from how it's affected literary production and the kinds of books that are being written to the sorts of things that both you and Dell are describing. So, well, I think we're at the end of our period. I really want to thank both of our presenters. Those were wonderfully fascinating and insightful, illuminating, and I really want to thank everyone who joined us here today.